By morning, nobody will recognize you, Officer Garrett Miller said, and the room went so quiet that even the fluorescent lights seemed to hold their breath. Naomi Brooks sat in the metal chair beneath them, hands resting calmly on her knees, her orange county jumpsuit still damp at the cuffs from the rain outside. The intake room at Westbridge County Jail was colder than it needed to be, all gray walls, steel drawers, scuffed tile, and a mirror cracked across one corner like a frozen lightning strike. Miller stood behind her with the clippers in his hand, smiling at her reflection instead of her face, the way men smile when they think a badge has made them larger than the truth. Two other officers lingered near the door, one older and bored, the other young, pale, and uneasy, his name tag reading Ross. Nobody spoke. Nobody asked why a woman arrested for a minor disturbance needed her hair cut before processing. Nobody reached for a form, a policy binder, or a supervisor. In that room, silence had learned to wear a uniform. Naomi looked at herself in the broken mirror and saw what Miller wanted her to see. A black woman alone, tired, outnumbered, stripped down to a file number before anyone bothered to learn her name. But beneath that stillness, she was counting everything. The time on the wall clock was 7 minutes slow. The camera above the supply cabinet was angled away from the chair. The floor drain had fresh cleaning marks around it. Miller's body camera was off, though department policy required it during intake. And the young officer by the door had not looked away once. Miller leaned closer, lowering his voice until it became almost friendly. "You ladies come in here thinking attitude is armor." Naomi did not blink. Rain tapped softly against the small, wired window behind him, a nervous rhythm in the dark. "Which policy authorizes this?" she asked. Her voice was low, clear, untouched by panic. The question landed harder than a shout. The older officer shifted his weight. Caleb Ross glanced toward the dead camera. Miller's smile tightened. "Policy," he repeated, as if the word itself had insulted him. He rested one hand on the back of the chair, close enough for Naomi to smell the bitter coffee on his breath and the starch in his uniform. "In here, I'm the policy." The clippers buzzed to life, a thin electric sound that filled the room and crawled along the walls. Naomi watched the first dark strands fall across the gray tile. Not many, just enough to make a point, just enough for Miller to believe he had taken something from her. But he did not see her eyes lift to the mirror again, not toward herself this time, but toward Caleb Ross, whose thumb had slipped quietly to the side of his phone inside his jacket pocket. Naomi's face remained calm. Miller mistook it for surrender. That was his first mistake. Caleb Ross had been on the job for 11 months, long enough to learn where the clean reports ended and the dirty habits began. He knew which hallway cameras flickered only when certain officers were on shift. He knew which intake forms came back with missing lines. He knew how fast a supervisor could turn a complaint into a misunderstanding if the person complaining had no lawyer, no money, and no one waiting outside. But until that night, he had always told himself knowing was not the same as choosing. Naomi Brooks sat motionless in the chair, while Miller moved around her with the slow confidence of a man performing for a room he believed he owned. A few strands of hair lay on the tile near her shoe, dark against the pale floor, almost delicate in the harsh light. She did not reach for them. She did not lower her head. Her eyes stayed fixed on the cracked mirror, watching everything without appearing to watch at all. Caleb felt the phone inside his jacket pocket growing warm against his palm. His thumb had found the record button by instinct, or fear, or maybe the part of him that had been waiting for one clear reason to stop pretending. Miller turned slightly, blocking Naomi from the older officer near the door. "You got something to say, Ross?" he asked. Caleb's throat tightened. The room smelled like disinfectant and wet concrete. Outside the wired window, rain blurred the parking lot lights into long yellow streaks. He could feel the old officer staring at him, warning him without a word to keep his face empty. Caleb swallowed. "No, sir," he said, and hated how small it sounded. Miller gave a short laugh and looked back at Naomi. "See? Even he knows how this place works." Naomi's gaze shifted in the mirror, just enough to meet Caleb's reflection. There was no accusation in her eyes. That made it worse. Accusation would have given him something to defend himself against. Her calm only left him standing there with the truth. She looked away first, and somehow that felt like mercy. Miller clicked the clippers off, and the sudden silence had weight. He stepped in front of Naomi, studying his work with cold satisfaction. Now maybe you will remember where you are. Naomi touched the side of her hair lightly, not with panic, but with the measured care of someone checking evidence. I know exactly where I am, she said. Miller leaned down, close enough that the metal badge on his chest caught the light and threw it across her face. Then say it. For the first time, Naomi turned from the mirror and looked directly at him. Westbridge County Jail. Intake Room 2. 8:31 at night. Officer Garrett Miller present. Officer Daniel Haas present. Officer Caleb Ross present. Body camera inactive. Fixed camera obstructed. The room went still. Caleb felt his breath stop. Miller's smile disappeared, not all at once, but slowly, like heat leaving a piece of iron. Naomi continued, her voice even. And an unauthorized grooming procedure performed without medical cause, written consent, or supervisory approval. Hask muttered something under his breath. Miller straightened. You some kind of lawyer? Naomi did not answer. She only looked at the clippers in his hand, then at his badge, then back to his eyes. You should put all of this in your report, she said. Exactly as it happened. Miller stared at her for 3 long seconds. Then he laughed again, but this time the sound did not fill the room. It bounced off the walls and came back thin. Take her to holding, he said. Hask opened the door. Caleb stepped forward before he knew he was moving. I will do it. Miller glanced at him, suspicious. Naomi rose from the chair with quiet dignity, her shoes whispering against the tile. As Caleb led her down the corridor, he kept his hand light near her elbow without touching her unless necessary. The hallway lights hummed above them. Somewhere behind a door, a television played low and distant, kin laughter leaking into the jail like a cruel joke. Naomi walked as if the orange uniform had not reduced her, as if the missing hair had not diminished her, as if the building itself was already being measured for judgment. At the holding cell, Caleb paused. His voice came out barely above a whisper. I am sorry. Naomi looked at him through the narrow gap of light. Do not be sorry, she said. Be accurate. The door closed with a soft metallic click, and Caleb stood there for a moment, phone still recording in his pocket, understanding that the night had not ended. It had only begun. In the holding cell, Naomi Brooks sat on the lower steel bench with her back straight and her hands folded in her lap, listening to the building breathe around her. Westbridge County Jail had its own language after midnight. Pipes knocked behind the walls. Keys clicked at distant doors. Radios whispered in short bursts of static. Somewhere down the hall, a vending machine hummed like it was the only thing in the place still telling the truth. The air smelled faintly of bleach, rainwater, and old paper. Naomi let each sound settle in her mind, placing it beside the details she had already collected. Intake Room 2. Camera obstructed. Body camera inactive. Unauthorized procedure. Officer Miller. Officer Hask. Officer Ross. She repeated the facts silently, not because she feared forgetting them, but because facts had saved her more times than anger ever had. Years earlier, before the robe, before the federal courthouse, before people stood when she entered a room, Naomi had been a girl on the south side of Chicago watching her mother come home from double shifts with sore feet and a voice that never lost its gentleness. Her mother used to say, "Do not let cruel people teach you how to become cruel." Naomi had not understood the weight of those words until the world tried, again and again, to make dignity feel expensive. Now she sat under a thin jail blanket, with uneven hair brushing the side of her face, and she understood perfectly. Across from her, an older woman named Teresa Alvarez watched quietly from the opposite bench. Teresa had silver hair pinned in a loose bun and hands marked by years of kitchen work. She had been picked up over an unpaid court fee that should have been cleared months ago. You are too calm, Teresa said softly. Naomi looked up. Am I? Teresa gave a tired smile. People who belong in here are never that calm. People who know too much are. Naomi almost smiled back, but the moment faded when footsteps stopped outside the cell. Officer Miller appeared beyond the bars, coffee cup in one hand, his expression rebuilt into confidence. Hask stood behind him with a clipboard. Caleb Ross was not there. Miller looked at Naomi as if the quiet hallway had restored his power. You sleep all right, Miss Bell? He asked, using the false name from her intake sheet. Naomi did not correct him. Well enough. Miller tapped the clipboard against the bars. You made quite a speech back there. Dates, times, policies. I have to admit, that was impressive. Hask chuckled without humor. Naomi held Miller's gaze. Accuracy often sounds impressive to people who do not practice it. The words landed cleanly. Teresa looked down at her hands to hide her reaction. Miller's jaw shifted. For a second, the badge on his chest caught the ceiling light, bright and hollow. You think you are special, he said. Naomi stood slowly, not stepping toward him, not raising her voice. No, I think the rules apply even when nobody important is watching. Miller stared at her through the bars, and for the first time that night, a thin line of uncertainty crossed his face. It vanished quickly, but Naomi had seen it. So had Teresa. Hask cleared his throat and handed Miller the clipboard. Transport list came in, he muttered. Courthouse at 9. Miller glanced at the paper, then back at Naomi. Looks like you have a hearing in the morning. Naomi's eyes flicked once toward the hallway clock. 8 hours. Maybe less. Miller smiled again, but it no longer reached his eyes. Let us see if you sound as smart in front of a judge. Naomi said nothing. She only sat back down as the officers walked away, their footsteps thinning into the corridor. Teresa leaned forward, studying her. You are not afraid of him. Naomi watched the pale morning beginning to press against the tiny window high on the wall. I am afraid of what men like him can do when nobody keeps a record, she said. Teresa nodded slowly. Down the hall, unseen by both women, Caleb Ross stood in a supply closet with his phone connected to a charger, replaying the recording from intake room 2. Miller's voice filled the small dark space, low and certain. In here, I am the policy. Caleb closed his eyes. Then he opened them, copied the file, and sent it to an address written on a folded card Naomi had slipped into his palm when he led her to holding. The subject line contained only 4 words, for tomorrow morning's court. The courthouse van arrived just after sunrise, its tires hissing over wet pavement as the first week light spread across Westbridge. Naomi Brooks stepped out with Teresa Alvarez and 3 others, her wrists held in front by policy rather than necessity, her chin lifted against the cool morning air. The county courthouse stood across the street from the jail, for stories of pale stone and tall windows, close enough that the same flag snapped above both buildings, yet far enough to feel like another country. Miller walked behind the group with Hask at his side, polished shoes tapping the sidewalk, coffee in hand, voice easy again now that daylight had returned. Big day, Miss Bell, he said. Try not to give the judge a lecture. Naomi kept walking. The wind moved softly through what remained of her hair, and for a moment she remembered her mother standing at a kitchen sink in Chicago, wrapping Naomi's braids before school with fingers that smelled like coconut oil and dish soap. The world may touch your crown, her mother had once said, but it does not get to decide your worth. Naomi held that memory like a warm stone in her pocket. Inside the courthouse, the air changed. The smell of bleach and old metal gave way to polished wood, paper files, coffee from the clerk's office, and the faint lemon scent of floor wax. Deputies guided the detainees down a side hallway where the public never looked too closely. A custodian pushed a mop bucket near the elevators. A defense attorney hurried past, talking into a phone. Nobody noticed the black woman in the orange uniform studying every exit sign, every camera dome, every familiar courtroom number on the wall. Nobody noticed the way one clerk at the far desk suddenly froze when she saw Naomi's face. The clerk's name was Marlene Whitaker, and she had worked under Judge Brooks for 6 years. Her eyes widened, then dropped immediately to the papers in her hand. She did not speak. She did not stare, but her fingers tightened around the file folder stamped emergency review. Naomi saw it and gave the smallest nod, almost nothing at all. Miller missed it. Hask missed it. But Caleb Ross, entering through security behind them in a fresh uniform with tired eyes, did not. He had not slept. The recording had been sent before dawn, so had 3 photographs of the obstructed camera and a copy of the intake log with Naomi's false name marked in Miller's handwriting. Caleb had spent the last hour wondering whether he had ended his career or finally begun his life. When he saw Naomi in the courthouse hallway, he expected fear in her face, maybe gratitude, maybe warning. Instead, she looked at him once with the same steady calm and continued walking. It steadied him more than any speech could have. At courtroom 3, the detainees were seated on a side bench while Miller signed a transport sheet near the door. He spoke to the bailiff like a man used to being believed. Routine morning docket, he said. One disorderly, one failure to appear, one unpaid fee. The bailiff, a broad-shouldered man named Raymond Ellis, scanned the list, then paused at Nora Bell. Something flickered in his eyes, professional and carefully hidden. "Judge will be ready shortly," he said. Miller smirked. "Hope this one brought her policy book." Hask laughed under his breath. Teresa looked at Naomi, then looked away quickly, as if she had begun to understand that silence sometimes had a shape before it had a name. The courtroom slowly filled with the low sounds of American justice waking up. Benches creaking, papers sliding, shoes whispering against carpet, the soft beep of a recorder being tested. Deputy Warden Helen Price entered through the back doors, her gray suit crisp, her expression pale beneath careful makeup. She did not expect to see Caleb. She expected even less to see him carrying a sealed envelope addressed to the court administrator. Naomi watched her take a seat behind Miller, watched Price smooth her skirt, watched her avoid the side bench completely. The clock above the judge's bench clicked toward 9. Miller leaned close enough for Naomi to hear him. Last chance to apologize for wasting everyone's time. Naomi turned her head slightly. Her voice was quiet, almost gentle. "Officer Miller, you still believe this morning is about me?" Before he could answer, the side door beside the bench opened. Bailiff Ellis stepped forward, his voice filling the room with one clean command. "All rise." Judge Naomi Brooks did not enter from the side door. The woman who stepped through first was Judge Elaine Porter, a senior county judge with silver hair, black robes, and a face calm enough to make the room straighten before she spoke. Miller rose with everyone else, his smirk returning for half a second, as if Naomi had finally been reduced to what he expected her to be. Another defendant on a crowded morning docket, another name that could be pushed through the system before lunch. Naomi stood from the side bench with the others, her eyes lowered, her uneven hair catching the courtroom light. The bailiff waited until Judge Porter took the bench. "Be seated," the judge said. Wood creaked as the room settled. Papers stopped moving. Even the air seemed to pause. Judge Porter opened a thin folder, looked over the top of her glasses, and said, "Before this docket begins, the court will address an emergency matter referred to chambers at 6:43 this morning." Miller's smile faded slightly. Deputy Warden Helen Price shifted in the back row. Caleb Ross held still near the aisle, his sealed envelope now resting on the clerk's desk. Judge Porter continued, "This matter concerns the identity, processing, and treatment of an individual booked last night under the name Nora Bell." A murmur moved through the room and died quickly. Miller turned his head toward Naomi, his eyes narrowing. Naomi did not look back at him. She looked at the flag beside the bench, the same flag that flew over the jail, the same flag that promised justice in both buildings, though only one of them remembered to look like it. Judge Porter nodded to Bailiff Ellis. He walked to Naomi's bench and unlocked the front restraint with careful respect. The sound was small, one clean click, but it moved through the courtroom like a crack in a wall. Teresa Alvarez covered her mouth with one hand. Hask stared at the floor. Miller took one step forward. "Your Honor, what is going on?" Judge Porter's eyes cut to him. "Officer Miller, you will remain where you are." He stopped. The words were not loud, but they carried the weight of someone who had never needed a badge to be obeyed. The clerk rose and read from a prepared statement. "The individual booked as Nora Bell is hereby recognized by this court as the Honorable Naomi Denise Brooks, United States District Judge, assigned under federal authority to observe and document conditions related to an ongoing civil rights inquiry involving Westbridge County Jail." For one full second, nobody breathed. Then every face in the room changed at a different speed. Price went pale first. Hask's mouth opened, then closed. Caleb shut his eyes as if the truth had finally stepped into daylight. Miller stared at Naomi, not with anger now, but with the stunned emptiness of a man realizing the floor beneath him had never been solid. Naomi rose slowly. She was still wearing the county jumpsuit. Her hair was still uneven. Nothing about her appearance had changed, and somehow everything about the room had. Judge Porter looked at her. "Judge Brooks, Chambers has received the initial materials. Do you wish to make a statement for the record?" Naomi stepped forward, not to the bench, not yet, but into the open space between the side row and the counsel tables. The courtroom lights softened across her face. "Only this," she said. "Last night I was processed in a room where procedure was treated as optional, Dignity was treated as negotiable, and silence was treated as consent. I was not harmed by one man's ignorance as much as I was warned by an entire system's comfort with it. Miller's face tightened. That is not what happened. Naomi turned to him for the first time. Her voice stayed quiet. Then the record should help us. Judge Porter nodded to the clerk. A speaker on the desk clicked once, and Miller's own voice filled the courtroom, low and certain, preserved in perfect clarity. In here, I am the policy. The words hung above the benches. No one moved. Naomi watched Miller hear himself, watched the arrogance drain from his expression and leave something smaller behind. Judge Porter closed the folder. Officer Garrett Miller, you are relieved from transport duties effective immediately and will remain present pending further order of this court. Miller looked toward Price, but she was no longer looking at him. For the first time since Naomi had met him, he seemed unable to find anyone willing to mistake fear for loyalty. The courtroom did not erupt. That was what made the moment heavier. No shouting, no dramatic gasp, no sudden rush of people to the doors. Just silence, wide and complete, settling over every bench, every file folder, every polished inch of wood. Miller stood near the aisle with his hands at his sides, his face still turned toward the speaker as if the machine had betrayed him by repeating what he had freely said. Judge Porter let the recording end without comment. The small click that followed sounded almost gentle. Naomi remained standing in the open space below the bench, feeling the cool air move across the side of her head where her hair no longer fell evenly. She could feel people looking now, not the way they had looked in the jail, with suspicion or habit, but with the uncomfortable focus people give to a truth they should have noticed sooner. Teresa Alvarez sat very still on the side bench, tears shining in her eyes though she tried to blink them away. Caleb Ross stared down at his shoes, his jaw tight, his shoulders lifted like he expected punishment to land from somewhere. Deputy Warden Helen Price was no longer pale. She had gone gray, her lips pressed together, her fingers gripping the strap of her leather purse until the knuckles showed white. Judge Porter turned one page in the folder. The paper made a dry sound. "Officer Ross," she said. Caleb looked up. "Yes, Your Honor. You provided the recording received by Chambers this morning?" Caleb swallowed. His voice came out thin, but steady enough to carry. "Yes, Your Honor. Did anyone instruct you to alter it?" "No, Your Honor. Did anyone instruct you to make it?" Caleb looked briefly at Naomi, then back to the bench. "No, Your Honor. I made it because I knew what was happening was wrong." Miller's head snapped toward him. "Ross." It was not a shout. It was worse than a shout. It was the old command trying to work in a new room. Caleb flinched, but he did not lower his eyes. Judge Porter's gavel touched the wood once, not hard, just enough. "Officer Miller, you will not address a witness unless permitted by the court." Witness. The word changed Caleb's face. Until that moment, he had been a young officer afraid of betraying the department. Now the court had given him another name, and names mattered. Naomi knew that better than anyone. She had worn Norabelle for one night and watched how quickly people used a name to decide how much humanity they owed. Caleb reached into his jacket and removed a clear evidence sleeve. Inside it was a small dark strand of hair, sealed and labeled in careful handwriting. "There is something else," he said. The bailiff took the sleeve from him and carried it to the clerk. Naomi's breath caught for the first time that morning, not because the strand mattered legally more than the recording, but because someone had chosen to treat what fell from her as something worth preserving. The clerk placed it beside the file. A simple piece of evidence under courtroom light. A small proof that humiliation had failed to disappear. Judge Porter looked at the sleeve, then at Naomi. For a moment, the older judge's face softened, not with pity, but with recognition. Outside the tall windows, the rain had finally stopped. Sunlight pushed through the clouds and reached the floor in narrow bands. One of those bands touched the evidence table, brightening the plastic sleeve until it glowed at the edges. Naomi thought of her mother again, of warm hands guiding braids, of a voice saying the world may touch your crown, but it does not get to decide your worth. She lowered her eyes, took one slow breath, and when she lifted her head, Miller was watching her. Not with power now, with fear. He had expected anger, maybe revenge, maybe humiliation returned in the same shape he had given it. Naomi offered none of that. She only stood straight, calm as a verdict not yet spoken, while the room learned the difference between control and authority. Judge Porter recessed the courtroom for 20 minutes, but nobody truly moved on. The sound of her gavel faded into the wood, and the room stayed suspended in the thing that had just happened. Deputies guided the morning docket to a side corridor. Clerks whispered over phones. The court reporter saved the transcript twice. Miller stood near the defense table, no longer polished by confidence, his uniform suddenly looking too tight at the collar. Deputy Warden Helen Price walked toward him with the careful steps of someone crossing thin ice. "Do not say anything," she whispered. Miller turned on her, voice low. "You knew who she was?" Price's eyes flicked toward Naomi, who stood beside the clerk's desk as Bailiff Ellis handed her a folded black robe from Chambers. "No," Price said, but the word came too fast. Naomi heard it. Caleb heard it. So did Judge Porter, who had not yet left through the side door. The silence sharpened. Naomi took the robe in both hands, feeling the familiar weight of it settle across her palms. Wool, lining, thread, duty. For one night, Westbridge had dressed her in a number. Now the court returned her name without needing applause. She stepped into the small witness room beside courtroom 3, where a mirror hung above a narrow sink. The light in there was softer than the jail, warmer, almost kind. She looked at her reflection. The uneven hair, the orange fabric, the robe draped over one arm. For a moment, the girl from Chicago looked back at her, the one who had watched her mother pay bills with tired fingers and still stand tall in grocery lines where people acted like patience was something black women owed the world. Naomi touched the side of her head gently. She did not feel beautiful. She did not feel broken. She felt awake. When she returned, the robe covered the jail uniform. That image moved through the courtroom before she said a word. People straightened. Miller looked away. Judge Porter resumed the bench, then addressed the room with controlled formality. Given the federal nature of the inquiry and the evidence presented, Judge Brooks will make a limited record regarding matters under her direct assignment. This court will preserve jurisdiction over the county violations. Naomi walked to the center podium, not the bench, because justice did not need theater to have power. She opened a folder Marlene Whitaker placed before her. Inside were not just Caleb's recording and photographs. There were complaints from the past 2 years. Names, dates, intake times, medical requests delayed, haircut without written reason, reports edited after midnight, cameras listed as malfunctioning during the same officer's shifts. Naomi turned one page, then another. Each page sounded like a door opening for someone who had been told there was no door. "Marcus Reed," she said. A man in the back row slowly stood. He was thin, middle-aged, wearing a brown jacket with worn cuffs, his hands clasped in front of him. Miller's face changed when he saw him. Not surprise. Recognition. Naomi looked at Marcus with steady respect. "Mr. Reed, you submitted a statement 6 months ago and were told it had been lost." Marcus nodded. "Yes, Your Honor." "It was not lost," Naomi said. "It was removed." The words passed through the room like cold water. Price lowered her head. Marcus blinked hard, his mouth tightening as if he had waited half a year to hear one honest sentence. Naomi continued. "This morning, the court received archive logs showing that Deputy Warden Price's credentials were used to delete your complaint from the internal review system at 2:12 in the morning on March 9th. Price stood too quickly. "Your Honor, I can explain." Judge Porter's voice cut across the room. "You will have that opportunity under oath." Miller took a step back from the table. Caleb watched him do it and understood, all at once, that men who built their power on locked rooms feared open ones most. Naomi closed the folder. Her voice remained calm, but now every word carried iron beneath it. "Officer Miller, last night you asked whether I still felt important. Importance was never the question. Accountability was." Miller looked at the robe, then at her face, then at the strand of hair sealed on the evidence table. The room waited. Outside, sunlight spread across the courthouse steps, bright and indifferent, as if morning had finally decided which side of the street it belonged to. The first person to speak after Naomi closed the folder was not Miller, and that was what finally broke him. Marcus Reed stood in the back row with one hand on the bench in front of him, his brown jacket hanging loosely from his shoulders, his eyes fixed not on the officer who had once made him feel invisible, but on the sealed strand of hair glowing under the courtroom light. "Your Honor," Marcus said, his voice rough but controlled, I kept a copy. Deputy Warden Price turned toward him so sharply her purse slipped from her lap. Judge Porter leaned forward. A copy of what, Mr. Reed? Marcus reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out a folded envelope, softened at the corners from months of being carried too close to his chest. My complaint. The original one. My sister told me never trust a system that only keeps paper when it protects itself. Bailiff Ellis walked the envelope to the clerk. No one rushed. The quiet made every step feel official. Miller stared at the floor, his lips pressed into a flat line. Price whispered something that sounded like a prayer, but had no peace in it. Naomi watched Marcus stand there, thin and tired and dignified. A man who had been told his story disappeared, only to bring it back in his own pocket. The clerk opened the envelope and scanned the pages. Marlene Whitaker's face tightened as she compared the signature, the date, the intake number. Your Honor, she said, the document matches the deleted record referenced in the archive log. Judge Porter nodded once. Enter it under seal, pending federal review. Caleb Ross exhaled, and the sound was small, almost childlike. Naomi turned slightly toward him. His shoulders were still tense, but something in his eyes had changed. Fear had not vanished. It had simply stopped making decisions for him. Judge Porter looked at Caleb. Officer Ross, are there other records the court should be aware of? The question hung there, clean and merciless. Caleb swallowed. Miller lifted his head slowly, warning him without a word. The old command tried one last time to cross the room. Caleb looked at Naomi, then at Marcus, then at Teresa Alvarez, who sat with both hands clasped in her lap, as if holding herself together. Yes, Your Honor, Caleb said. His voice shook on the first word, then steadied on the second. There is a storage drive in the administrative office. Officers were told it only kept hallway footage for 48 hours, but it backs up to a local server every night at midnight. Intake room 2 does not show the chair, but the hallway camera shows who enters, who leaves, and whether reports match the timeline. Price closed her eyes. Miller muttered, You do not know what you are talking about. Caleb finally looked at him. I do. That is the problem. The room went still again, but this silence was different. It was not shock anymore. It was alignment. One witness, then another. One record, then another. The wall Miller had trusted was not falling with noise. It was being taken apart by careful hands. Judge Porter ordered the drive secured immediately and directed the sheriff's internal affairs unit to remain outside the courtroom until federal agents arrived. Price asked to call counsel. Miller asked whether he was being accused of a crime. Naomi answered before Judge Porter could, her voice quiet enough that everyone leaned in to hear it. You are being introduced to the process you denied other people. Miller's face drained of color. Not because she had insulted him. She had not. That was what made it worse. She had only named the room he now stood in. Caleb stepped back, but Marcus stayed standing. Naomi looked at him. Mr. Reed, the court cannot return the months you spent unheard. Marcus nodded, his eyes wet but steady. I know, but it can stop pretending silence is the same as absence. His mouth trembled once. He pressed his lips together and sat down slowly, as if the bench beneath him had finally become solid. Naomi turned back to the front. The robe settled around her shoulders, heavy and warm. Beneath it, the county uniform still scratched at her skin, a reminder of the night before, of steel chairs and fluorescent light, and a man who thought humiliation could erase a name. But the courtroom had become something else now. Not a stage for revenge. Not a place for applause. A place where every hidden thing was being asked, one by one, to step into the light. Judge Porter's final order did not come like thunder. It came as paper, ink, and a voice steady enough to make the room understand that justice did not need to raise itself to be heard. Officer Garrett Miller was relieved of duty pending criminal investigation, his certification suspended by emergency referral, his testimony in open cases flagged for review. Deputy Warden Helen Price was ordered to surrender administrative access and remain available for federal questioning. The backup drive was sealed. The deleted complaints were preserved. The morning docket, once meant to pass quietly through the system, had become a record no one could fold shut again. Miller stood motionless beside the defense table while the words landed around him, each one removing a piece of the power he had mistaken for permanence. For the first time, he did not look at Naomi as if she were beneath him. He looked at her as if he had finally understood that she had never been in the room alone. Every person he dismissed had been there with her. Marcus Reed with his folded complaint. Teresa Alvarez with her unpaid fee and steady eyes. Caleb Ross with his trembling voice and recorded truth. Every missing report. Every blocked camera. Every name turned into a number. Naomi stood beneath the lights in the borrowed robe, the county uniform still hidden under it, her uneven hair visible at the side of her face. She did not smile. She did not celebrate. Victory, she had learned, was not always a warm thing. Sometimes it was simply the moment harm stopped moving forward. Judge Porter looked at Naomi with quiet respect. Judge Brooks, the federal court will be notified that Westbridge County is complying with preservation orders. Naomi nodded. Thank you, Your Honor. Miller suddenly spoke, his voice low and rough. I did not know who you were. The room held its breath. Naomi turned to him. The answer could have been sharp. It could have cut. Instead, she gave him the one truth he had spent his career avoiding. That was never the point. Miller looked down. No badge, no hallway, no dead camera stood between him and the sentence. Naomi continued. The law is not supposed to protect people only after you discover their title. No one moved. Even Price stopped crying. Outside the windows, sunlight spread wider across the floor, touching the evidence table, the sealed drive, the clear sleeve holding the strand of hair Caleb had saved. It looked small there, almost weightless, yet the entire room seemed to orbit around it. A few minutes later, deputies escorted Miller out through the side aisle, not with spectacle, not with cruelty, but with procedure. He walked past Marcus Reed and did not look at him. Marcus watched him go, then lowered his eyes, not in fear this time, but in release. Teresa Alvarez reached across the bench and squeezed Naomi's hand once before a clerk quietly corrected her case file. Caleb Ross stood near the door, uncertain whether he had earned the right to speak. Naomi approached him slowly. He straightened. Judge Brooks, he said, I should have done it sooner. Naomi looked at his young face, the sleepless eyes, the fear still leaving in pieces. Then do the next right thing sooner, she said. Caleb nodded, and this time the nod did not look like obedience. It looked like a promise. When the courtroom finally emptied, Naomi remained for a moment near the evidence table. Bailiff Ellis offered to retrieve a scarf from Chambers, but she gently declined. She touched the uneven edge of her hair, then let her hand fall. The silence around her was no longer the silence of a jail intake room. It was the silence after a storm when the air still remembers the rain, but the sky has already begun to clear. She stepped out through the courthouse doors into the late morning light. Across the street, Westbridge County Jail stood gray and square, its windows narrow, its walls unchanged. But inside it, phones were ringing, doors were opening, records were being pulled, and people who had learned to whisper were beginning to say their names out loud. Naomi paused on the courthouse steps as the wind moved gently across her face. She did not need anyone to recognize her. She had remembered herself the whole time.